proceedings. And next on our agenda is financial contributions. Summary statement. Hand over to Mr. Wesner.
Thank you. I'll start at section 2 of the overview of the topic. The operative district plan contains provisions that require subdividers and developers in open space that are undertaken within subdivisions and developments and are necessary to enable council-provided services to be used. In addition, subdividers and developers are required to pay a contribution councils for costs that councils incur in providing and upgrading council-provided services for land that is subdivided or developed. The financial contributions are calculated based on text descriptions in the rule, or a fixed dollar amount stated in the rules. District plan review. So the review of the financial contribution provisions concluded that the current contribution requirements are sufficient to meet the costs of growth and development in the district, being the additional servicing needs of infrastructure, roads and open space. The funding deficit from financial contributions is a result of increasing growth rates in the districts and increasing costs of construction. The review considered alternative approaches for calculating financial contributions. In addition, the review concluded that there's a lack of clarity or clear methodology in how financial contributions are calculated where upgrades are required. The revised wording was considered to provide clarity and increase certainty. The proposed plan contains a financial contributions chapter which sets out objectives, policies and rules. New objectives and policies specific for financial contributions are proposed to provide clarity on what is to be achieved and how the contributions are to be implemented. While there are new provisions, they generally reflect the existing philosophy of the operative district plan, being those who benefit pay. The rules of financial contributions in the proposed plan continue the current requirements that developers or subdividers pay the full cost of infrastructure for subdivision. In addition, it's proposed to continue the requirement that subdivided developers contribute towards the proportional cost of upgraded infrastructure that services the subdivision or development. And then in paragraph 8, in the 3 points there, I've summarised the key changes. Take those as read or read them out if you prefer.
I'm comfortable with them as read.
Yep.
Thank you.
In terms of the submissions on the financial contributions chapter, there were 12 original submissions with 42 submission points and 4 further submissions, 7 further submission points. The submissions were a mix of support and oppositions to the provisions in the financial contributions chapter, with those in opposition concerned about the costs on development and the suggestions that other mechanisms should be used to fund infrastructure costs, and examples were development contributions. In terms of pre-circulated evidence, there were 2 pieces of evidence received, both from the telecommunications company. I acknowledge and agree with this evidence that it's important to integrate land use and infrastructure planning. We also agree that the provision of telecommunication infrastructure supports the economic and social well-being of local communities. And I also agree that subdivision and development can place additional demand on telecommunications infrastructure. However, I disagree that the use of financial contributions is an effective and efficient way to fund the upgrading or expansion of telecommunications infrastructure. As telecommunications infrastructure is privately owned and operated, the providers of telecommunication infrastructure determine if, how, pays for upgrades and expansion in response to subdivision and development. Consider it as inefficient for a council to be involved as an intermediary between the telecommunications providers and the subdivider and developer to negotiate the upgrade or expansion of telecommunications infrastructure. In addition, I consider financial contributions via a resource consent process an ineffective and inefficient mechanism to implement the outcome of this negotiation and for council to collect these contributions and then transfer them to the telecommunications providers. I consider a direct agreement between the telecommunications companies and the subdivider developer to be more effective and efficient process and mechanism. Amendments in response to the pre-circulated evidence. And then I've just listed the main matters in contention, which are whether financial contributions should be included in the proposed plans, mechanisms outside of the plan should be used, whether the policy should refer to infrastructure generally or specific types of example there being telecommunications infrastructure. That's my statement. Happy to take questions.
Thank you. Any questions in relation to the summaries?
Yes, please. I've got a couple. Hamish, thank you. I thought it was really, really good and succinct. I've got a couple of questions, and I'm not, that won't change what you've written here, but I just want to understand it. In the one of the calculations of the RUE, you've got studio, 2-bedroom, 3+. Was there any consideration given to bigger houses, or bigger contribution?
Not specifically from memory. I think my view would be that larger houses, in terms of very large houses, more than say 6+ bedrooms, would be relatively rare. And if they were, while it might have a specific localised upgrade, I think they're so rare that it wouldn't be. Or if it's a house that was going to be used for accommodation or other purposes, like not a typical family home or that, it would potentially be triggered by one of the other land use rules, such as physical accommodation rules.
I'm just interested because there's obviously some very big houses getting built in Greytown, for example, and a lot of them generally have swimming pools, and so the demand on infrastructure is quite high. Okay. Second one, what's your understanding of what's going to happen to contributions with the water services? What happens there? Because they are effectively, whilst they'll be council-controlled organisations, assuming we go Y+, they're still independent organisations, and will we be able to collect financial contributions for them, or will they have to do it themselves, or how do you see that sort of playing out?
Firstly, on whatever the water service operator is, and their form, and whatever that form is in the water services legislation, it says as part of the the transition agreement. So this is the agreement that each council and the new water service entity would create as part of the overall transfer of or whatever takes place. One of the specific requirements of that agreement is what happens around contributions. And that includes whether the water service entity itself will want to take contributions. And if it does, it has to develop a policy and then implement that policy. And I understand all options are on the table as to what the councils and the water service entity could agree to. So they could agree to that the council has no involvement whatsoever, that it's all handled directly by the water service entity as a subdivider to water entity arrangement, similar to telecommunications now, or it could be done through the councils if the councils agreed. So the water service entity might impose the requirements, but the councils could be the collector of that contribution and then have the agreement to pass on those funds to the developer. So
either way, it'll be a plan change.
Correct.
And then can I do my last one? Which one was it? I've just completely forgotten what it was. But no, I'll have to remember. I'll come back to it. Sorry. I had it in my mind.
Did you not write it down?
No, it came up when I was thinking.
Yes, I've got a couple. Thanks, Mr. Wesley. Just remind me, do any of the councils have a development contributions policy?
At the moment, the chapter provides for any of the councils to introduce a policy, and there'll be no need for a plan change to avoid the double dipping scenario. There's an exemption included in the financial contribution chapter to say that.
So if added, the provisions deal with that.
Correct.
Aside from the submissions that you've reported on in the summary statement, the evidence that you've considered in the summary statement, we're only 12 submitters. Yeah, I think I read that somewhere.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And in terms of the 42A, there were no recommended changes.
No, very minor wording one, but nothing.
Okay.
For example,
So be read,
adding as a matter of discretion, the subdivision standard 9.
oh,
There was an error in the proposed plan where it still referred to the draft plan rather than the proposed plan financial contributions. That was the recommended amendment.
okay, so this raises this integration issue again, doesn't it? Yeah, is that shown in the subdivision?
Not in the chapter in front of you today.
Because I went through the provisions attached to the 42A and couldn't see any red text at all.
Correct, because there's no recommended amendments to the financial contributions chapter itself, only the subdivision chapter.
Okay, I think that's all from me. Yes, that's all from me.
Yeah, P6. So the annual review, and I think we talked about this when we were going through the early stages, and I'd really like to see that. The only issue I have doesn't sort of tie the three councils to a review together on it. Should we be, we talked about something in one of the other hearings we did about making sure that any changes to the plan were district wide. We need to perhaps contemplate that for this as well. Otherwise, we're going to end up in a situation where one council might say higher or lower or whatever, and you get that disjointedness across the district again. So is that something that could be looked at?
Could be. I wouldn't as a change to the district plan itself in terms of borrowing a joint one. And I say that in terms of the methodology and the formulas in the chapter provide the detail of how the contributions are calculated. It's up to each council to determine the costings of its infrastructure and then how it's going to be apportioned to subdividers and developers. Where each of the councils may have a different view on that. But
isn't that the beauty of having a combined district plan, that it provides certainty across the district for, given that our developers and our people operate across the district? Isn't that the basis of this to begin with, to provide certainty?
Yes, and that consistency across the three districts. There may be differences though in terms of, say, the infrastructure upgrade requirements in one district to the other, that might influence the
Aren't we talking,
numbers.
isn't that annual review of district-wide contributions talking about the actual figure, not how it's distributed?
Correct, it is the actual.
So shouldn't the figure be consistent across the district?
I'll give an example. Let's say, and these are just theoretical numbers for the sake of simple calculations. Marston was proposing to spend 20 million on capital expenditure to upgrade its wastewater treatment network, but Cardiff was only proposing to spend 2 million upgrading its capital expenditure for wastewater. If the Marston figure was 10 times the amount, the contribution would be correspondingly higher across in Marston than Carterton, and so from a equity perspective, to me, the district plan provides the mechanisms to enable that individual calculation to take place, but the individual amount, I'm saying, will depend on the circumstances and the costs for each council. So there might be some combined conversations between the three councils around some form of consistency, but that was one of the weaknesses of the operative plan, was that single number approach across all three districts, that it didn't reflect the different funding requirements and upgrades that may be required for growth across the three, that there might be variances. So my advice is not to enshrine that requirement to review them collectively in the plan, but that from an operational perspective, that could be done outside of the plan.
And it would make sense in part of the council's so annual plan time and long-term plan time, like we do with other fees and charges.
For alignment.
Yeah. Getting-
Just, we could call it standardisation
Mhm.
rather than harmonisation.
Sounds familiar.
There you go.
You have plenty of time.
Yeah.
I don't know what you're griping with about.
Could have had a longer coffee break.
Yeah.
Our first submitter that we do have is Ms. O'Hagan, who I believe is joining us online. Not sure. Oh, sorry. My apologies. I'm just so used to. If you would like to join us at the table. Welcome. Over.
Okay, I've never been to one of these before, but we just had some comments on the, obviously the transport standard, and I think I'd say my, evidence submitted and read. My main comment on the transport section was that the comment as written, the plan as written, it didn't seem to take into account smaller rural subdivisions or different roading standards. A lot of it's taken from the state highway standard, and there's not much account taken in for smaller, such as a back road in Martinborough for a little single lot driveway. It's all in there that it has to be seal widened and a standard that you'd expect for an entrance on the state highway. And I've just covered that off in my evidence. So I don't know if you've read it and have any questions to ask on it.
We have read it, Mr. Hagan. Have you read the summary statement that was issued last week from the officers commenting on evidence such as your own?
No, I don't think I'd received that. I saw one about the site distance table. Was that?
This is a,
It's on the actual district plan website under the hearings. There's the
Oh,
summary statements.
okay. Sorry, no, I haven't read that.
Yeah, came out last Thursday.
No, I have to. No, I didn't read that.
okay.
Yeah.
It's important that members do read those because it's a sort of a headline news summary of where the officer's at, having had the opportunity to read some evidence such as your own. So we've had that presented to us this morning,
Oh, okay.
and it covers off all of your submissions.
Oh, does it?
Yeah. The bad news is that the officer hasn't really moved at all
Okay.
in relation to those. So, but she explains why she's adopts her positioning.
There has been on your in relation to standard 12 turning and passing, and you consider that the standard should be consistent with engineering standards. That has been accepted and
Yeah.
everything has been amended on that particular one.
Oh, okay. Great.
On your, just there's a really quick recap for you on your stormwater management and firefighting access, because you hadn't originally submitted on that those 2 points were out of scope
Okay.
as well.
Yes.
There's a copy actually in front of you, actually. If you,
Yeah.
one of those papers will have be entitled, title. Officers hearing introduction, summary statement, transport.
Okay. Right.
And so if you go to the third page, sorry, the fourth page, is it?
So it's in paragraph
Down by
5, 1.3.
Paragraph 24.
Paragraph 24 onwards.
Oh, okay. Right.
That's we'll give you just a little bit of a some quick look.
Oh, I've got crossing. Yeah.
Essentially, what the officer is saying is that on the stormwater management and the firefighting, there was no scope provided in the original submission by Adams and Shaw to deal with those matters.
Yes. Correct.
On the turning and passing one, agreement with the submission, and changes accepted. But on the other ones, the S6, S8 and S10, no changes recommended.
And also on your table, PR5 for the vehicle crossing, that hasn't actually been matched as part of the PDP.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
In fact, there has been a change, sorry, I led you wrong there, to figure TR3 is going to be replaced with figure RO4.
Oh, okay, that's possibly that's the minimum site distance one.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, well, yeah, it is a shame that I didn't have a good look through this.
On the vehicle crossing, that they are based on requirements of the different standards from NZTA and the council engineering development standards as well.
Yes, so that there is an issue there because it's the engineering development standard doesn't cover those lesser accesses. And we did comment on that engineering development standard, but it was, I guess nothing was done and it was adopted. So it's still it will be an issue for developers if you have to widen in, but there's not actually physically room to widen, but you're supposed to be putting in widening for a vehicle crossing. There's not room in the road reserve or the shoulder, but I don't know if you can say any more on the process, obviously.
Yeah, I think probably some of potentially not an issue here, but it was with the engineering development standard, there are some issues that we've picked up in there, but that's obviously already been adopted. So we don't have an opportunity to comment on those, I guess. So that's where
Are you both preparing and lodging subdivision consent applications within the districts?
Yes. And that's where probably a couple of those things where maybe it wasn't addressed initially in the initial scope, we've since picked up because we're working with these rules on every day now. And often it's when you actually pick them up by actually using the rules is when you
completely understand that. So, I mean, the entry level for subdivision in most zones is controlled. Mr. Wesney reminded us that where you don't comply with land use standards also, there's a requirement under the standards to comply with land use standards and the relevant district-wide rules, etc. Don't do that, you generally trigger to a restricted discretionary activity. In fact, non-compliance with the vehicle crossing formation and the rural access design will generally default to restricted discretionary activity. It's not that you're requiring to lodge a consent that you wouldn't have otherwise had to lodge. You're still lodging a subdivision consent, just another matter to consider. Is that considered to be a hardship or a difficulty? Are you able to argue your case for a lessening of the standards as a RDA?
Well, at the moment, we've been referencing the new rules, but the access standards don't have legal effect yet, if I'm correct. So they haven't been triggering any change in activity status under the proposed plan, even though we've been kind of summarising them in our application, but we've generally been defaulting back to the rules that do have. So that's the operative rules at the moment for access.
Yes.
Yeah.
Whether it's a matter of control or a matter of discretion, say it's a matter of discretion, presumably there's a matter of discretion that relates to, for example, this is, I've just picked this out of this was subdivision and get about the coastal environment. Presumably subdivision in the rural zone will talk about where relevant compliance with council's engineering standards, legal and physical access to and from roads, from lots. So I guess what I'm trying to understand is whether there's enough ability to argue a departure from the standards through a resource consent process when you lodge your resource consent and have it considered. Rather than changing the standard, in the rules, is there enough wiggle room, for example, for where there's good reason to depart from a standard for council to,
Probably our experience, and I'll
Yeah.
get you to follow up, is that it's tends to be looked at the rules of rule. So even if we can't comply with something, and we may have a good reason for explaining why we're not meeting that, oftentimes the response is the rule says
That's what the rules say.
X, Y, Z, you have to do that. So generally speaking,
Mm.
probably with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sort of depends on current staff and the position, and they're just saying, well, this is the rules, that's what you have to do, where, yeah, there are times where it's not practical or not required, actually, because you're applying a standard for a state highway to a back rural road of, that's gravel or, you know, like an access.
one of the things we've asked the staff to go away and have a look at is whether the rules can be differentiated between the type of road or the speed conditions that apply to the road, and they're going to do that in their right of reply.
Oh, cool.
So it would be your practical experience that even though there are the thoughts that, I'm just trying to get the wording here, that on a small rural backwater road, or not backwater, let's smaller, where it would seem obvious that these standards, there could be some wiggle room. But is your understanding that planners are very much rule driven?
Not planners
No.
necessarily,
Okay, yeah.
because often the access feedback is coming from the
Engineering stuff.
engineering staff.
Mm.
That's feeding in.
So we might go to, and because we're working with 3 different councils, you might go to one council and they say, oh, you know, that's fine. And then you go to the other council and it's not fine, or another council and it's, you know, no, yes or no. So it would be, in terms of us designing, it's nice to have it there, the standard set that, well, this is actually a rural road. It's fine to have that. There's a standard. You don't need a state highway standard for this sort of thing.
So you're seeing variation between the 3 councils?
Yes, yeah, we do with the approval of depending on what's on someone's agenda at the moment, I guess, whether it's someone experienced who knows that, oh, that will actually be fine out there, or you've got somebody new who's no, well, this is the standard, this is what you must do, even though it's quite a variation of.
So you see a direct correlation between new staff compared with more experienced staff?
Oh, sometimes, not all the time. That's quite a broad
Not trying to put
general.
words into your mouth. And
Yeah. There is a variation between staff, I guess, with, yeah.
thank you.
For us. Thank you.
Ms. Hagan, do you see a potential issue where excuse me, the New Zealand, the engineering standards have gone through a process and they've been adopted, and that the district plan is therefore taking those standards or the key ones and putting them as standards in their district plan? Do you see an issue in the district plan changing those standards and therefore being in contravention of the engineering standards? Do you see that as a potential issue?
It could be, because as I understand it, I believe South Wairarapa have not completely adopted the engineering development standard that was written in by Masterton, and then you've got Carterton somewhere in between. South Wairarapa refer to their development standard as NZS 4404, which is what we use. So we've got 2 different things happening there. So I'll put something in with 4404, which will be fine there, but it's not fine in Masterton because we need to go back to the engineering development standard. So Mr. So-and-so here on the boundary says, oh, why did my neighbour get to be able to build that, whereas I have to build this? So there is a little bit of a thing in, I guess, technically, South Wairarapa are perhaps not working under the district plan, because it's the document in the district plan refers to as the engineering development standard.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is a sort of.
Got to consider concepts such as efficiency and effectiveness.
Yes.
And particularly the efficiency of, say, a restricted discretionary activity to decide the appropriateness of departing from that standard or not.
Yes.
And that's why I asked you that question earlier about how much additional effort is required from you to put together a resource consent application over and above what we normally have to do with a controlled activity.
Yes,
To argue the toss on a non-compliance with the standard.
because sometimes we don't look at, you have a brief look at the engineering part of it to think, yeah, we can get an access in there. There's a good place for it. That's site distance. We don't get into the nitty gritty of it till you've actually got your resource consent. So then it's sometimes, it's probably can be a little bit hard once you get out there and do your topo survey and think, oh, actually, we can't comply with what's in there, but you didn't actually apply for the restricted.
Can't comply or don't need to, or not need to, but it's not appropriate or practical for the,
To what extent does the engineering design process post-consent assist or hinder this issue?
Do you mean like when you do the?
For your 223 and 224, yeah.
Oh, so that's because you have to get that engineering design approval before you start building. So that's after the consent is issued, and then you're trying to comply with the wording of the consent, which is
some of those works like access construction will be works for the purpose of 223 presumably. And
yes, yeah, they all have to be done before that. Yeah.
okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I didn't really have anything else to say. Unless anyone has any questions.
Do you have questions from anyone?
Thank you.
Thanks for your time. And thank you also for accommodating us and coming in a bit earlier.
No, that's fine.
Appreciate that.
So you've got a big day.
Thank you.
Not as full as some of the days have been. Okay.
Not letting you open the door. But I will.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you. Nice to see you both again.
Nice to be here. That's last time. Yes, I am expecting Mr. Paul to join us online. If you don't mind, I might just
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
come on now. I had told him.
Josephine.
Like we're on the slot. I'm sitting. Yeah, okay. Cool. No worries. Sweet. Just if you want to just jump on you back and do that. Okay. Mr. Cancel is currently making his way back from another meeting and not at his desk, so he will join us if and when he can. Otherwise, it is Mr. McCarrison and Mr. Anderson presentations today.
Yes.
And we'll start with
me.
Mr. McCarrison.
All right. So you would have seen from our corporate evidence our position on roads, basically. So as a telco, I represent, New Zealand's longest serving telco. We've had assets on the road for just about as long as there's been tar sealed roads. And so our view, as set out in the evidence, is very clear that roads or transport corridors are very much for infrastructure corridors, and we anticipate those words better used going forward. And if we went back to the legislation that the Labor government put in place, we'd moved into the terms of infrastructure corridors and the proposed national planning framework for infrastructure.
So we spoke about this last time.
Yep.
So is there any change to what we talked about last time that you're? It's okay. Exactly.
Yeah, so
Same point.
it's the same point about, so this is the transport chapter, and it's recognising that within transport there's other infrastructure. And so I suppose at a practical level, I don't want to be in the situation of arguing with particularly roading engineers who not have infrastructure, cell tower or cabinet or something that we've gone beyond the national environmental standard for getting resource consent to have policies potentially used against you for, I think, some of the reasons that you've talked about, NZTAs, zero harm policies and so forth. So it's just having a recognisable, even playing field for infrastructure in the roading corridor. That's the point of the industry around this. And then on the other points, we believe that councils do have a role in ensuring that there's connectivity for people doing subdivisions or new developments. And while we're private infrastructure, so is electricity. And while our industry has a number of operators, four in particular that build network, but we're not the only ones. To ensure the role of council is to ensure that there is connectivity. Doesn't matter whether it's Sparks connectivity, One New Zealand's, 2 Degrees, choruses, but there is actually connectivity, and preferably there's that opportunity for people to have choice. That's how our telecommunications system is governed through the Commerce Commission. It fights hard for New Zealanders to have a competitive telecommunications network system, and New Zealand's been very successful in that. If you read the Infrastructure Commission's report on our industry, we are the shining light in terms of success of competition. But the regulatory framework needs to enable that. We depend on council because they're the ones talking to developers about connectivity and just making sure that if someone buys a section, that they're going to be able to pick up their mobile phone and make a call or however they want it. And that's the nub of where the industry's coming from, and from Tom's point of view.
To talk about financial contribution.
And financial contribution. It's part of the financial contributions is around, again, ensuring there's connectivity. There might be a development in an area where there is no capacity, or actually there's still no connectivity for people. So the new developments are not going to be able to get connectivity. In our industry, the area will be in a do not sell situation. So if people phoned up, they would not be able to buy a telco product because we couldn't meet our fair trading obligations to customers. So to provide the services. So it's primarily a little black spot. And so if there is one of those and you're getting new developments in an area where there's no connectivity, then you can't call 111, you can't do the things that people expect to do today as of right. And in rural areas in particular, we get urban people that go, oh, I'm going to buy a lifestyle block. They don't generally check, is that property going to have connectivity? The previous people might have some plan that their mobile plan, and it'll go with them. And the new people can't connectivity when they move to that. And that is changing with a whole range of different products, but it is an issue. And if there is one of those areas, then it seems to us that the council should be enabling a developer to have that conversation with ourselves who provide a cell tower. And so as part of a financial contribution requirement for that, the same sort of rules would apply. Developers don't tend to pay for the whole thing because it has benefit for the wider community and so forth. But there should be a facilitated conversation and recognition in the financial contributions, directions in the plan to facilitate that. That's kind of where it is.
Can I just take you back?
Yep.
Transport
Yes.
division, in particular, so it's policy 3, role of transport corridors. In relation to that, if you actually go back to the introduction of the transport chapter, it talks about transport, an efficient and effective transport network is critical to functioning economic support to convey people, goods, services in a safe and effective manner by any mode of transport. And then a little bit further down, it talks about the zoning applying to roads, railway corridors, etc., and its provisions to deal with on-site transport facilities. Bearing in mind that the telcos have been addressed in the network utilities chapter, I'm in reading the policy P3, which is identify, manage, and classification of roads and other transport corridors. I'm just a little unsure how adding an infrastructure in this particular thing when it's actually in relation to transportation and vehicular and rail, etc.
I understand that perspective.
Yep.
And to make it simple for plan users, I guess, is another, yeah.
That's right. That policy is titled Role of Transport Corridors. And I think the role of transport corridors is wider, and it's not an unusual addition to a policy. I'm aware of it in the Wellington proposed district plan and corridor, where transport corridors are specifically recognised as infrastructure, being appropriate locations for other infrastructure. And I guess the flip side is, as Mr. McHarrison mentioned, should there be an application for something within a transport corridor, some other infrastructure in a transport corridor, that a council planner looks at that policy and says, well, we can't issue that resource consent because the role of the transport corridor is solely for transportation. And I know we've got the link to zoning applying to roads, but then network utilities sit slightly outside of the zones. The zone provisions apply, but they're in their own chapter. So it's strengthening it in that regard is I guess the amendment that we're thinking, that it's a recognition that the transport corridors are used for other roles aside from just transportation.
It is because of that singular focus of this transport chapter.
And transport chapters under the National Planning Standards are a vexed issue as well, and that transport is infrastructure, and some different district plans have taken the view of what aspects of transport are infrastructure in the infrastructure chapter, and the land uses activities and transport of what forms of transport chapter. Here it's more holistic, and which is why we've got the two lanes, if you like, of network utilities in one chapter that completely excludes roads, and transport in another chapter that includes infrastructure being roads. And therefore we've got this issue now where that recognition of other network utilities and roads doesn't neatly fit into the transport corridor, and I accept that. But it also means we've got that gap in the plan of the no recognition that transport corridors are appropriate locations for other network utilities.
We discussed this under the utilities chapter, and a lot of people, and we asked the officers then to go back and speak to NZTA and get some information, but we haven't had their statement back yet, and we've asked them again today that same question. So I think we're probably going to go around in circles on that. So let's wait and see what comes back from there. And that will guide us into how we would make that decision. Would you think that would be a fair?
Actually, I'm just interested in hearing answers to my questions. And
hopefully that's nothing more from my perspective.
I mean, I'm pretty open and well known for my position around the planning standards, templates splitting out one part of infrastructure. Suppose I go back to the Auckland Unitary Plan, which has one chapter that includes infrastructure. And that's always been the focus. And I suppose I was the lead facilitator for forcing council into E26, which is completely comprehensive around policy, the frameworks for everything related to infrastructure. And the work that I do with other infrastructure organisations to eventually move us into comprehensive planning for infrastructure in one place, including the transport corridors, is, I think, a good planning outcome.
Do you think, sorry.
Philosophically.
About what he just
Through the
said.
chair.
Madam Chair, may I
Yes,
ask
you may.
Do you think, we hear a lot, we've got a,
Yeah, no, fair. I've picked up on that. Yeah.
Some of these.
Good. Yeah, look, I can see, wonderful job as chair.
we see it a lot from submissions, using cities as examples.
Yeah.
This is not a city and we've got 30 kilometres between one, Masterton and Featherston and so on. And so the road corridor is very different to Lambton Quay. And the speeds that people travel on. And so you've got this view of NZTA that they want to protect people using the road corridor. And your infrastructure is big and immovable and creates hazards, as we know. So it's a balance about how do we fit in a built-up area compared to how do we fit on an open road corridor where vehicles and trucks are moving at a different speed. So that's so using Auckland as an example may well fit the argument in Masterton, but doesn't fit between Masterton and Carterton South and Smiths.
I think you'll still find that those road corridors are the linear corridor for fibre, not necessarily for
It's underground.
Yeah, or no, it's not always underground.
Quite
Yeah,
often
actually, it's
above ground,
usually
on
above.
power poles.
Yeah, it's strung between the power poles. So that, I guess here we've got two things at play. One's linear infrastructure, which is either above or below ground, and the other's the fixed infrastructure, which is the poles and the cabinets. And the poles and the cabinets are encouraged under the RMA framework to be in road through the National Environmental Standard. And there's clear permitted activity. So Spark, as of right, could go in State Highway 2 between Carterton and Featherston under the RMA, but that safety analysis comes through the corridor access request to the Road Controlling Authority.
And that's the tension.
And that's, well, I don't think it's a tension. I think that's appropriate. What this is trying to encourage through the relief sword is that RMA perspective of bringing everything into a single corridor is an efficient use of that space. From a Spark or Chorus in particular perspective around fibre, you're dealing with one landowner. You've got known processes for corridor accesses for how to maintain and upgrade that fibre, and so letting the RMA process play it out well, recognising that the Transport Authority process, whether it be a corridor access request to NZTA in the highways or either of the three councils in a local road, lets the safety aspects be appropriately addressed by the appropriate people at the appropriate stage, while recognising we've got permitted activities in those legal roads under the resource management framework, whether that be the NES or the district plan. So I'm just trying to find some recognition around that, which is why I've used the word recognise in the relief sword. But it doesn't flow through into anything else in terms of the standards, because those are already in play through two different mechanisms.
Yeah, so I suppose if you take our process to put a silt out in the road, so our preferred place is to put them on the road because it's a great place. In a rural road, then it's in places that are wide enough, and depending on who we're going to, whether it's under the the road's under the control of NZTA or the local authority, one of the earlier conversations is around the appropriateness of that location. Because if we're triggered a resource consent for height or something, the last thing we want to do is go through a consent process for a roading engineer that didn't get the chance to see it as part of that early stage, although they usually do and will comment.
Yeah.
But if we were putting in our car application, so a corridor request, then the roading engineers have at that stage, let's say it was permitted, and to comment that this is an unsafe position, or we would like you to put in place these crash buffers, or actually putting frames around it just to absorb or cushion, or make sure what form of frangibility is that pole. So if it was hit, what's the likelihood? But at the end of the day, all of us as drivers have to take responsibility for what we do. And so while NZTA's got that policy and it looks to be changing, our speed limits are changing again, I think we need to, all of us, be reasonably designing our infrastructure, but the road environments, and keeping infrastructure as far away from the carriageway where possible, particularly in high traffic environments. So that's kind of how it is. Like if we want to put it in the motorway, transmission gully or anything like that, if you get your new second highway across here, then there's we need to be behind crash barriers if we get the chance to go into those corridors. So I think the engineering safety part works really well. The RMA and recognition that these are good, sensible places, people expect them to be in these places. So recognise it. That's kind of all it is that we're asking for, basically. So.
David, I think.
Mr. McCarrison, Mr. Anderson, I completely understand what you're saying.
Yep.
I just want to understand the size of the issue. So by that I mean is you're seeking a policy recognition,
yep,
so that when a utility, telco, doesn't fit within the NES, or it's not provided for in the district plan activity.
Can I just clarify something for you there, Mr. McMahon? It will always be under the NE when we're talking about road.
Right.
So, okay, that's useful. What's out there? Is it always an oversized?
It's always one that exceeds.
Yeah.
Yeah. So oversized is the NES is allows for something which is 3.5 metres higher than the existing or poles in road reserve are, provided there are existing within 100 metres. And so the telco's height, permitted height ability is limited by whatever the size of the existing pole.
So the difference, I mean, there will be a pole under the NES. If it's higher than that's what's permitted, it's just a taller pole.
Yep.
Yeah.
Still a pole.
Yeah. So is it mainly an issue for the fixed infrastructure as opposed to the linear, or is it
Yeah, linear is.
both?
No, it's linear is permitted generally.
What about for new poles for linear?
Again, they're generally permitted.
Okay, so it's really the fixed things like
Yeah.
like cell towers, like cabinets,
Yeah.
like multi.
Hand in hand. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And so the scale of the issue, the numbers, I mean, they're not huge numbers,
No.
but they're important as we're densifying the network. Our ability to move poles to different locations, quite different, is very limited.
So what we're hearing is that really the NES is quite permissive.
Yes.
Generally, you can work within it. There'll be times, however, where you have to have a larger pole or whatever.
Yeah.
That's not provided for in the NES. And you're really looking for an absence of a policy barrier for a consenting party.
That's right. It's
That.
yeah, I think that summed it up really nicely.
Okay.
The only thing I'd change with your summary statement, if I may. More often than not, the NES means resource consent is required.
Yep.
So the heights that are offered in the NES aren't high enough for compliance with the radio frequency.
Yeah.
That's changed over since the NES was introduced. So typically I can think of a number of examples where poles are generally between sort of 8 and 10 metres high in legal road. I'm talking light poles and power poles, so on and so forth. And particularly in the rural areas, to get that long, wider coverage, they need greater height. So we're looking at kind of 15 to 20 to 25. Generally in controlled activity status under the NES, whereby you're exceeded the permitted height, but you're complying with the underlying zone height of the district plan. And then therefore, as we talked about this last week, in terms of controlled activity status, I've just done 11 exactly like that in Christchurch, another 4 in Queenstown, one in Motueka. We did a whole swag of them up here in 2023. One's just around by the supermarket. All illegal road, all COC, not COC, controlled activity resource consents, which is an issue in itself in terms of the efficiency of the NES, but that's the landscape that we're operating in. So more often than not, resource consent is required, but again, more often than not, it's a controlled activity.
Understood. It was important that the panel understand the nature of the issue. That I mean, a lot of things will be permitted, and it's just a matter of lodging your car application and dealing with engineers. And
that's right, and it's
where they're oversized for whatever reason, a resource consent will be necessary, and you want some sort of policy recognition to assist with that.
And well before the car application, before there's any application, when we visit the sites or a search area, some councils are better than others at this, but and NZTA are really useful. We'll say Spark might come to the team with a search area. There's a whole lot of sites in Legal Road. We go and visit the sites where there's a bit of a filtering exercise first, where you say that there's no way you're going to get resource consent here, or the RF engineer says there's no coverage from here because of X, Y, or Z. You visit the ones that may work for everybody, and on that site visit, a roading engineer from council and, if applicable, from NZTA come along, and they actually say that one there's a driveway, don't even look at it any further. You know, they'll help filter it down. So it's like constraints get down. Then from what might have been 12 to 15 candidates up front, you might end up with 2 or 3, or one we did last week, we've only ended up with 1. So it's always useful having those engineers involved at the outset.
Let's go to the wording of the relief sought.
Yes.
The wording in blue in your evidence on page 12, is that the wording that was provided in the submission?
From memory.
Okay. So recognise that transport corridors are an appropriate space for other infrastructure. Yep. And it's those last 2 words that are of interest. Obviously, they were chosen with care. That would provide for telecommunications, but would provide for other infrastructure users also.
Yes.
Was that the intention?
Yes.
Okay. So electricity. What else?
Water, stormwater.
Yeah. Okay. Electricity and 3 waters.
Electricity, 3 waters, really. Yeah. Anything linear. I'm trying to think about I can't speak for other providers, but the intention there was, essentially linear infrastructure is captured.
Yes.
And
And you haven't sought any changes within any further changes to the transportation chapter to give effect to that policy, because presumably it'll be in the network utilities policy, right? The benefit is derived.
That's right. Yes. And that comes back to what I was talking about earlier with how the transport as infrastructure is allocated into the different chapters under the national planning standards.
And looking at the appropriateness of that rule, that policy and alternatives, are there any alternatives that would involve a policy change within the network utility chapters to deliver the same outcome.
I haven't turned my mind specifically to that, but my initial thought is this policy discussing the role of transport corridors, and I think that is important because if it was in a different chapter, there's a potential conflict that needs to be resolved, whereas having it in chapter integrates, I think.
Okay, that was all from me.
Any other questions from?
That's just transport, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, subdivision.
I'm just double checking that
Yeah.
there's no others. Okay. Subdivision or financial contributions? What
Well,
would you like next?
Should we do a subdivision?
We can do
Yeah.
We'll just hold it a minute because the recording will.
Three
times, yeah. Unless it's a false alarm, then it'll be one.
Unusual.
Makes it really, really difficult when we're recording for people to hear over it, yeah.
Unusual for Carden.
No,
No.
no. Not
Rural
unusual.
area.
Unusual to have to pause the hearing. Well,
Yeah.
Foreign. Yeah.
And all of our council meetings too.
Wouldn't that be ironic?
Although we're quite lucky that the hearing wasn't at the weekend because they were going off all weekend.
Oh, really?
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, you were right.
Subdivision one, based on Mr. McCarrison's description, is making sure that any subdivision new development have connectivity to the network. And the relief sought on that is in the subdivision chapter at the policy and rule/standard level.
Well, mainly focused on the policy and objective level. I think the rules and standards are nearly appropriate.
Right.
There's only a small tweak to those. We've got standard 6 around network utility services, which require electricity and telecommunication services to be provided to the usable area of each new lot, where lines pass within 200 metres of any boundary of any new lot. We didn't submit on that.
Okay.
If that position probably has shifted, there's no scope there to do so. But because of that, we're sort of, I guess, looking at making sure the objective and policy framework aligns with the rules that require compliance with sub S6, and also recognising that there is telecommunications available in rural areas as well. So that's the nub of the issue, really.
Right, so sub 02 policy to
Yes,
R2 to some extent.
that's right.
Did you manage to read the summary statement? The officers?
Briefly, I did leave home slightly earlier than anticipated.
Yeah, it was posted late last week. Yeah.
Yes, it was. I think it was Friday, but
Okay.
I was otherwise occupied. One of those visits I was telling you about earlier.
Yes.
Yeah.
This fellow field is referred back to 42A report at paragraph 146 as the reason for rejecting that submission. Okay. So do you want to take us through the changes that you're proposing then to O2 and P2?
Certainly. So sub O2 is looking for subdivisions within urban boundaries to connect with telecommunication networks and power networks alongside the council services. Yes. The recognition there is that the Wellington Regional Policy Statement does not differentiate between council services and privately but infrastructure. Infrastructure covers the three waters, it covers telecommunicate and a range of others, but in terms of what services urban networks, it is those five that are listed there. For rural zones, I've said are capable of connecting to telecommunications networks. That's recognising that I think that the coverage the telcos provide is I think 98%.
That's clause B.
That's clause B. Yeah. Very similar to for policy 2 and a new clause C, ensure within the urban boundary new allotments can connect to a telecommunications network, and thinking about that and discussing with Mr. Cantor in particular around lines. He's not on, unfortunately. The 200 metres provision means that in existing urban areas there is always an ability to connect to that existing line linear network. And then D, again, an ability to connect to the telecommunications network. So not requiring a connection, but that a connection is available should somebody wish to connect it in new allotment to a network. Subdivision rule 2, subdivision of land to create additional allotments. Would you like me to put it in?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Yes.
To be fairly decent. It's good sounds.
Also be down north. I can't cope with what he was going with.
Okay, and finally, sub R 2.1, as I was saying, that has as a controlled activity, compliance is achieved with sub S6, which I mentioned earlier, but seeking a new matter of control about provision of appropriate telecommunications subject to sub S6, and the intent there really is to encourage whoever the subdivider or the subdivision applicant is to have a conversation with the companies so that their requirements are met and that serviceability is achieved as per the objective and policy framework just outlined.
What does sub 6 say?
Sub S6, just had it and moved the bear with me 2 seconds. There's
It's on page 25.
Yeah.
25.
I've got it on.
network utility services, residential zones, commercial and mixed use zones, general industrial zones and rural zones. 1, electricity and telecommunications services shall be provided to the usable area of each new lot where power lines and telecommunications lines pass within 200 metres of any new lot. And if you can't comply with it, the matter of discretion is an alternative provision of power supply and
Okay.
communications.
Is that all zones?
It's residential, commercial, mixed use, general industrial and rural. So
So,
in rural zones. So it doesn't include open space, recreation. So, which I think is fine.
but it covers it generally covers within the urban boundary and in the rural zones, which are the 2 limbs of the objective and the policy.
It covers the living and the business areas where connectivity would be
Okay.
useful.
So given that those provisions in sub 6, are you saying that there's a policy and objective sort of gap?
That's exactly right. Objectives and policies talk about connecting up to infrastructure and how to dispose of it or deal with it on site and rural, whereas there's the same prescription for electricity and power, electricity and telecommunications in the rural framework, but it's not emphasised in the objectives and policies.
And what is 8.1, the new matter of,
It's the matter of
what will that deliver?
a discussion with the telecommunications service providers so that sub S6 can actually be achieved.
Could that be expressed as a matter of information to be provided,
It could be,
as opposed to a matter of control?
that could be.
The sub S6 sort of does that already, doesn't it?
Sort of.
Sort of, yeah.
Technically should.
It's open to interpretation.
Yeah, as to what,
So if none of these changes were made to the policies, objectives, or the matter of control, could you not just rely on sub S6?
You could rely on sub S6. Yes.
Still, say sub S6 is a standard. You don't comply with that standard, presume you go from control to RDA.
That's right. And where the alternative provision of power and telecommunications comes in.
Yeah, okay. But,
Is it the gap being, someone's got to can argue it, the policy.
yeah, okay.
I don't need it.
Yeah, understood. Okay, I understand.
You got it?
I've got it, but
You got it?
Yeah.
Got it, that's great.
I've got a couple. Right. Sub 02, I understand your argument around paragraph A. I'm interested, I want to examine a bit more on the rural zones. Is something like Starlink, as an example, is that a telecommunications facility? Yep. Okay, so if that's the case, why isn't that an option? Why do we need to put something in the rules when somebody can just go out and buy Starlink, for example?
but you can't just go out and buy a Starlink. Starlink, like any of our other networks, is subject to capacity issues. And so a lot of Starlink, so on any one day, Starlink may or may not be available, basically. And so I think it's fair for a subdivider to have something from Starlink to say, yeah, there's going to be capacity for people in this area to sign up if they're depending on their connectivity, so that when I come along and buy a section at some point, there will be some way of communicating so that if something happens, I can actually communicate. That's the purpose. So it's at a practical level.
Yeah.
It's knowing that there will be connectivity available.
So we're talking
Starlink's
an emergency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So underlying this is an emergency.
But from anything.
I quizzed the radio frequency engineer about it once for a rural site. Just, in the last sort of 6 months, and he's come back and said, Starlink is like the resilience if our network goes down. But if everybody relied on Starlink, or in the search area relied on Starlink, capacity wouldn't exist. People would barely be able to text, let alone make calls, stream videos, would do whatever it is that people expect to do on the iPhone 16, for example, or whatever it is. So it allows, it's a patch, I guess, when at the moment, and that's probably going to change, right?
Yep.
Like it could be a future where everything's delivered by Starlink or
Well,
but
we don't
know that at the moment. It's the kind of the backup generator, I guess, is the way to put it, and that's how it's been some issues around that as well.
And so it is. It's the important thing is the conversation with network providers, and then with the developer to then reassure council that there will be a service so that you don't get complaints later on when someone goes, I brought this section, council said there was connectivity, I've tried to get it and there's none. And
Why would council say connectivity?
Did you prove the subdivision?
Because it's approved.
Okay, so that's if we go with your recommendation. But so
at the moment,
okay, so okay,
connectivity is part of this.
That's the subbies.
Yeah, but there's plenty of subdivisions of blocks up in the hills, in our hills here, that have no connectivity whatsoever, and people buy them because that's exactly what they want.
Yeah, I think
so. That brings me into P2. When you say if I look at P2D, which says ensure, so that's actually you must. That's not a. There's no wiggle room in it.
That's right. And I think that goes back to the ability to connect. Yes, there might be people who buy a section and not care about a connection to telecommunications. Equally, there could be people who want to buy a section, but that's not an option for them because there isn't the ability to connect to telecommunications. And so what D in particular says by having the words an ability to connect to telecommunications is ultimately it's still the landowner's choice. But if they're choosing to want to connect, then they've got that ability to do so. If they choose not to, it's up to them.
You accept there are considerable parts of New Zealand that are completely outside of your coverage area
at the moment.
At the moment?
We would disagree with that.
Okay, so
and it's
so you will.
Where
are you saying your coverage network you've got now covers what?
So I've provided you with Spark's 4G and 5G coverage maps. Those coverage maps, as I said, with Starlink and any other provider, change from on a daily basis, basically. And that is why we don't want anyone to rely on a so-called coverage map without evidence from a network operator. Within New Zealand, because of the topography of New Zealand, there are areas that do not have connectivity, or it will be patchy in parts of a farm, rural area, go out into so as we're developing satellite technology, that will improve. But if you go under a tree, a satellite cannot see your device, so therefore cannot connect.
Okay.
The plan already requires that.
Yeah.
So if we were to adopt this in Part D, would that have a chilling effect on some more highly remote areas that are subdivided currently?
The plan already requires it. D's just backing up what this sub 6 already says.
So would it be appropriate, Ms. Fallowfield, are you hearing all of this discussion?
I am.
You are. Perhaps it would be appropriate to have some communications between yourselves and Ms. Fallowfield a little bit further to investigate this and then incorporate in the right of reply.
I'm happy to do that.
Thank you. Awesome.
I'm very happy with that question. I guess if I had one residual question, it was just what the wording there is an ability to connect to means.
Don't have to connect. To go back to Mr. Plummer's point,
Yeah.
if somebody buys an allotment, chooses not to connect, they don't have to
Okay.
have connection, but
As opposed to can connect, which is the urban boundary test.
connection must be in.
Okay. Okay. And presumably you could come up with some wording for 8.1 that translates it to a information requirement as to a matter of control or discretion if necessary.
That's right.
It's got one comment. With any utility company, whether it be power, water, telcos or whatever, there is always an out clause as I see it that in there that whilst you can provide ability to connect, there's always not a 24/7 supply consistency, as in power outages, water down, etc. And there's always that clause in there that exists. Is that still correct?
Yeah.
Pretty much, but we do operate in a highly regulated environment, and so customers have that ability to complain and get out of contracts if the service being provided isn't appropriate. So we are very careful. That's why we put areas into stop sell, basically. It feels very crude, but it's a reality where if you don't have capacity, but it does change, and it goes up during the day, at night, 6 to 8, high peak period for streaming and everything else when, our children and so forth are watching things on multiple devices. So, it does change.
Financial
contribution.
That's one last question, right? So technology do you think technology is going to make what you're asking for redundant?
I don't know when. Is the answer. So what we do know is that connectivity, the demand for data is increasing. If you're talking about satellites replacing, it's going to take a hell of a lot of satellites to cover the world to provide the connectivity that cell sites need with satellites. For the ground-based ones to be phased out, there's no plans that are public, or there might be someone in some corporate office in America that's got plans for that, but there's nothing that the industry is planning for. We're just planning to utilise satellites, which is well documented between all the companies, basically. It's a add-on to our networks, basically. Cyclone Gabriel and various others have shown that in our resilience plans, Starlink or other satellite providers are a core part of key cell sites now. So
I think the simple answer is not in the lifetime of this next generation of the PDP.
And probably not the one after that either. So, yeah.
Okay, on to financial contributions.
Have you read the summary statement?
I have read that one. That was one I did get through.
Any?
I think the point around, I really truly understand the point around privately owned infrastructure and financial contributions. And I think that is a discussion best left to the corporate with the council. What I'm seeking through this evidence is that should there be an opportunity for a telecommunications or any other private infrastructure to receive money from a financial contribution, the way that those objectives and policies are worded means that it can only be received, I think, from water, wastewater, stormwater and transport. And by removing that and making it infrastructure, if a decision is made outside of the PDP, then through Section 108 of the FMA, that financial contribution could be part of it could be apportioned to infrastructure outside of those four listed. Otherwise, it is limited just to those four.
So I guess my question to you on that is recognising that currently those four, and who knows what happens when LD, local water done well, comes through. But they are all infrastructure and communities facilities that are conducted by councils.
Right.
Hence, it's easier to the councils to collect
Yep.
as opposed to being a collecting station to then
Right.
pass on. And I guess my thought process when I read your evidence, like understand where you're coming from, but from a council point of view, with our especially small councils, limited resources, adding another layer of work and resources required from staff point of view to.
Yeah, I don't think the policy does. I don't think it changes that.
No.
I think it still allows that, like the discussion from Spark or any other telco initiated with council would happen regardless. If there was a decision on that, again, this is outside of the district plan, but then the hamstring to that decision is the policy framework. So I don't think it compels an additional level of administration. And yes, that's probably the way to put it.
Yeah.
And it may never,
Yeah,
because it may never work out in that way. But this is saying if it did work out, and I think there's probably a clear indication through the evidence and Mr. McHarrison's words that council, that telcos or could approach council to say, hey, can we have a share of this infrastructure funding? Then that allows under 108 for that to happen. So it's I know it's really been difficult.
Yeah.
But I guess my RMA position is going back to that regional policy statement around what is regionally significant infrastructure, and it covers both council and private. And we know that water, transport are hugely important to the success of towns, as are electricity and telecommunications. So and they all come at a cost.
Yeah.
So, anything to add?
no.
Of course, I got questions.
That's all night.
Okay, so, my understanding, and we'll use electricity, for example.
Yeah.
My understanding is the billing requirements of our electricity providers, and their matrix of how they do their billing, part of the componentry of that is for the expansion of their network and upgrading the network. Yeah. And they are governed by the electricity, whatever they're called, regulator.
Yeah.
Right. So that's how, when I pay my electricity bill, part of that goes towards the expansion of their network. Supposedly.
Yeah.
It's meant to.
Yeah.
Whether it does or not, in theory it does. I would assume that is exactly the same for telecommunication providers.
No.
So you don't base your billing on the need to expand your network and upgrade your network.
So in terms of the industry, so clearly we model our network needs, and you have to remember it's across the whole country, and where there is a non-commercial need, then those areas are less likely to be funded. And if you think back over the last 10 years, so our industry has a levy taken off us by the government, principally for funding areas where it's not commercial to provide network. So often rural areas, so the rural broadband initiative and its various forms recently, and ultra-fast broadband in urban areas, and now out into the smaller urban settlements and so forth. A bulk of that money has come through our levies on users, Starlink has finally promised to pay some bills in terms of that. It hasn't been up to date. So there's that sort of money. So we fund and plan for network where we perceive there's demand. It's hard to.
So you don't recover that cost, those levy costs, anywhere in your charging regime across the country?
In terms of our budgets will include obviously a levy fee and so forth, but you were talking about planning for a new network. So we plan for a new network, more likely in the higher growth areas, and that's where it is. And
But you also cover the cost of unseen network and the environment anyway, so you're covering your costs.
We don't know where that's going to be, basically. So it's hard to predict where it is going to be, and the network will only be built currently where there is an economic viability for that. That's how we deliver returns to our shareholders and so forth. So where someone decides to go and live out in a rural area, they cannot necessarily expect to get telecommunications because they choose to buy a section or develop a piece of land, and the government does not necessarily have to use our levies for things that will advantage that one person out there. We don't have control over that. That's, as you'll probably be aware, competitive fund, local government, local MPs drive complaints about network coverage into the Ministry for Business and Enterprise to then put business cases for that, and then we bid for sites. So yeah.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I'm just conscious of time and that we've got other submitters waiting online. So thank you both for your time. Thank you for coming in earlier.
No, it's not a problem. And if I can confirm my homework. Sub 6 in the policy framework to support to discuss Ms. Fallowfield, and 8.1 consider it a note as instead of a matter of control and present that through a memo. I'll add that too. It's from Hearing Strength Zealand, which will be on Wednesday.
Okay,
thank you.
Taylor, are you still with us?
Hello, can you see and hear me clearly?
Yes, we can, and thank you for your patience. Sorry, we're now running a wee bit late.
No problem.
So
yeah.
Over to you. We have read your evidence.
So just by way of brief introductions, my name is Thomas Chevalier. I'm a planner at SLR Consulting. I'm here on behalf of the fuel companies, which comprises BP, Mobil, and Zenergy. My evidence focuses on the high traffic generating activity provisions. And with my evidence taken as read, would it be helpful for me to go through the key points and then respond to some of the comments made during the introduction, as well as Ms. Treadaway's summary statement?
So I think, if you can sort of focus on, you've read the summary statement?
Yes, I have.
Maybe if you just focus on any matters that are still outlined for you would be useful.
Okay, I'll just go through some of the notes I made. So at paragraph 21 of the statement, Ms. Treadaway states that the current rules apply to new and existing activities, so that any changes would require consent. It's unclear to me at this stage whether this sentence is part of a summary of my evidence, or if she confirms that this is in fact the rules approach. And at this stage, it's also unclear as to whether she agrees or disagrees with this approach. At paragraph 36, so she identifies a key matter of contention in relation to my evidence as being the allowance for a 5% increase in traffic generation, and her concern is that it could result in cumulative effects as it would apply to any activity. As I wrote in my evidence, the 5% allowance is just a placeholder at this stage. I undertook a survey of district plans when I was preparing my evidence and then expanded that survey last week. And unfortunately, I couldn't find an example that was useful and would fit in with the PDP's approach of basing the thresholds on vehicle movements. And I just propose that as a starting point, and I would be happy to participate in conferencing with Ms. Treadaway to find a more practicable solution. And I just know that the 5% figure is really a nominal amount that recognizes that there could be some traffic increase from activities on a site, which could just be incidental to normal operations, rather than a result from the change works. You could, in theory, avoid cumulative effects by requiring that the change doesn't increase an existing exceedance at all. However, this still runs into the same issue of practicability, in my opinion, being the need for a traffic engineer to demonstrate this, and whether it's possible to conclude that there won't be any increase in traffic. Ultimately, the key issue is that it would be inappropriate for any changes to existing HTGA to require a consent and an ITA, irrespective of its impact, if any, on traffic. So yeah, at this point, unfortunately, I don't have a clear solution for the panel at this time, but would be happy to undertake further conferencing. In terms of the other points in my evidence, the statement didn't comment on the other recommended clauses for Rule 5 or the minor corrections to the other HTGA provisions that I raised in my evidence. And in Appendix 1, I couldn't identify further amendments to the chapter based on my evidence. So it's unclear to me what Ms. Treadaway's opinion is on those matters at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. I will check with my.
Yeah, I've got a question. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure if you were watching this morning, but I asked straight away the question, some of the examples you gave about what might occur on the forecourt. Some are business as usual, I suppose, expansion of business as usual, and some are replacing fuel tanks or whatever that need to be done from periodically. Would you consider that there is a difference between routine maintenance of your site and expansion of your site from a traffic perspective?
Yep, so on that particular point, and specifically the tank replacement example, I raised it following my research of previous consent applications in my company's records, and we've assisted the fuel companies in a lot of different service station works, upgrades across New Zealand. I raised that because there was one district consent application in the Waikato which involved retanking and some minor upgrade works at an existing truck stop, which included a service station activity trigger under the zone. And it came to mind as the application experienced significant difficulties during processing due to the extent of transport assessments that the council asked for. Despite the submitted traffic assessment confirming that there would be a negligible increase in traffic.
Just a table.
And related to that, I know that there was some questions from the panel to the officers on the issue of temporary versus permanent traffic and how that relates to the rules. So I understand that the intent of HTGA rules and plans is usually to manage permanent, i.e. operational traffic, and not necessarily construction or temporary traffic. That being said, I'd also welcome confirmation from the councils regarding that.
So do you think there might be more benefit in looking at this from a time perspective as opposed to an activity perspective? How long is your activity going to occur, whether it be 1, 2, 3 months and then it goes back to business as usual, or because it won't have a permanent effect on transport issues.
I think we should stick with the sort of the framework for what we have for HCGA rules across the district plans, where it focuses on operational traffic only. I know that because construction traffic varies per site, per activity, and there's usually rules in district plans regarding construction traffic. I'm not sure at this stage if there's a construction traffic rule under the PDP.
Thank you.
Yes, it's Commissioner McMahon here. I accept that the 5% is just a starting point that you're wishing to develop, but wonder whether there might be some inherent problems with a percentage anyway, given that it depends on establishing a baseline level to start with. And how would a council know what the baseline traffic generation is for service station?
Certainly, I guess one.
Sorry,
Yes.
we've just got our fire sirens going off, so if you don't mind pausing.
Yeah.
Only for the recording, we won't be able to hear you properly, so it'll go off 3 times.
That's
and
fine.
It's the third time it's happened, so hopefully it's the last.
Maniacs. They're asking for more people.
I think they found them last night. They found the post negotiation. It's called. It's a friend of mine.
I can get hurt.
He's well known to police and to courts.
Okay. Over to you.
So the first question was really about whether the 5% is a workable, regardless what the percentage is, given that it's 5% of whatever the baseline is, and how will we know what the baseline traffic volumes are? Doesn't give the council a lot of certainty.
Yes, yes. Was there anything else, Commissioner?
No, just what's your comment on that?
My response to that, in terms of baselines and the approaches that I've seen in other district plans, not just in the context of high traffic generating activities, but other sort of activities and works, is to perhaps base it off of basic quantity of the activity at the time of notification, or they make reference to perhaps the level of traffic that was approved under a previous consent or a previous ITA. Yeah, in terms of options, it is challenging. Sort of working within this framework of vehicle movements, and I understand the reasons why the council went for that, reading the section 32. And other district plans take the approach of activity-specific thresholds, and I cite the Whangarei example, which uses GFA, refueling spaces, which are a lot more measurable. But again, that's a different approach to what we have in the PDP. If we were looking at a specific provision for the fuel companies that's just limited to service stations. And if, following conferencing, if it does take place, we can't really find a solution, then we could look at a provision that just bases it off of refueling points for existing service stations.
Yes. Okay, well, that's sort of where I was going to head in terms of my direction, because I think the panel would accept that in genuine circumstances where changes to existing service stations don't result or have inconsequential changes in traffic movements, then the need for a basic ITA or a full ITA doesn't seem efficient. So the question is, how can we define that with some certainty? And that's probably where the conferencing could lead, even if it's on a without prejudice basis. For example, a very simple way would be to provide exclusions in the table under table TR17 under the entry for service station, which says excludes replacement of tanks, excludes well, this rule does not apply to replacement of tanks or changing fuel dispenser layout or changing internal site circulation or installing electric vehicle stations, provided there's some agreement that none of those activities that are listed in the exemptions have an impact on an adverse impact on circulation, internal circulation or access, such that a ITA would be of use.
Certainly, that is a potential pathway that we could look at, and if conferencing is undertaken, perhaps we could provide two pathways, looking at a vehicle movements based approach and an activity specific based approach for service stations.
Yes,
if you would find that helpful.
I think we would, and I don't want to provide too much direction, but if there was an exclusion approach that listed the type of changes to an existing service station that were exempt from the need to provide an ITA, then it might also be qualified by the terms that where there is no new access point or no change to the pathway, tanker pathways or something like that. But I'll leave that to you, Ms. Treadaway, to work through.
Yeah, certainly some homework. And I guess I'd also make the note that in addition to the HCGA rules, we also have transport standards, and for service stations and virtually all zones, there are either restricted discretionary or discretionary activities. And as I raised in my evidence, traffic effects would still be well within the council scope as well.
Yes, except that there's a section 10 existing use rights issue here also, and that some of these service stations may have been established many years ago. They might have access ways and crossing links that are non-compliant. We wouldn't want to see those worsened in any way.
Certainly, yes.
That's it from me.
Any straight away you're happy to do something? No, yes. Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. O'Brien, sorry to keep you waiting. Do come and join us. Do you have a summary statement or?
I've got some speaking notes all read out.
If you'd be able to email those to.
Absolutely.
Or have a copy of them later, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Kia ora koutou, Chair and Commissioners. Ko Sam O'Brien tukuinga. I'm a policy advisor at Greater Wellington Regional Council, and my qualifications and experience are set out in my evidence. Today I'm also joined online by policy advisor Josie Knight-McLean, who has relevant experience for the matters covered in this hearing, working on RPS Change 1 transport policies and the implementation of freshwater direction. So I've read the respective summary statements for the transport and subdivision chapters where they relate to the matters covered in our submission. And today I'll talk to the evidence I provided ahead of the hearing and focus on the outstanding relief Greater Wellington is seeking. So starting with the transport chapter, Greater Wellington supports the transport chapter and acknowledges the work of the officers in implementing the RPS Change 1 direction. Greater Wellington supports the introduction of the reference to greenhouse gas emissions in transport to give effect to the direction on RPS Change 1. I agree with the intent of the policy change, however, I consider the wording could be slightly amended for clarity. As drafted, the policy could be interpreted as seeking to reduce the effects of greenhouse gas emissions. I propose this is reworded so it's clear that the policy seeks to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases, and I can provide drafting in the speaking notes. With respect to Transport Policy 4, Greater Wellington supports the changes made in the summary statement in line with our submission and evidence to highlight the role of on-site facilities in facilitating multimodal transport use. Greater Wellington supports the introduction of the travel choice assessment consistent with policy CC2 of RPS Change 1, and further, Greater Wellington supports the changes through the summary statement to Transport P7 and the consequential changes required in Transport Rule 5 and then in Standard 17. Greater Wellington maintains the position that minimum car parking requirements should be removed from Transport Standard 16. As noted in my evidence, I'm aware that the removal of minimum car parking requirements is not required in Carterton and South Wairarapa. However, I still consider an assessment of the appropriateness of the standards still needs to be undertaken. The reporting officer states in the Section 42A report and in the summary statement that private motor vehicles are the primary mode of transport in Carterton and South Wairarapa, and parking minimums are required to manage traffic effects. Despite the removal of parking minimums not being required, I considered that the effectiveness and the efficiency of the standard as a mechanism for managing those traffic effects needs to be assessed. The traffic effects have not been provided, but my assumption, as outlined in my evidence, is that they relate to safety impacts of any potential increase on-street parking. I note that developers in many cases will continue to provide parking in response to market demand. And as outlined in my evidence, safety effects can be managed through other mechanisms, including speed management, street design, parking management, and road safety campaigns aimed at behaviour change. Further, promoting mode shift through the PDP and other mechanisms will reduce any potential traffic effects. And the proposed standard needs to be considered in the context of any other potentially unintended consequences that the standard may have. And I've outlined these in my evidence, but I'll just provide a short summary. So RPS Change 1 provides directions on enabling housing affordability and choices, and parking minimums add new cost to developments, including opportunity cost for a space that park occupies, and then in turn these costs be passed on to people's housing costs. Minimum car parking requirements limit housing choices by prohibiting housing typologies that do not provide an on-site car park, and removing minimum parking requirements provides flexibility to developers to provide a diversity of housing options. Many developers will continue to provide car parking facilities on-site to cater to demand within the market. Parking minimums also induce demand for private motor vehicle use, conflicting with RPS Change 1 direction, but also direction within the plan that looks to facilitate a mode shift, such as in Transport Policy 1. And as well, the current situation does not necessarily reflect future transport patterns, and locking in future housing typologies, other developments as car dependent appears counterintuitive to those mode shift policies. The requirement for on-site parking facilities also mandates impervious surfaces and developments that can lead to detrimental outcomes for freshwater, conflicting with RPS change policy freshwater 3. And finally, I consider there's unnecessary complexity added to the PDP by separating car parking requirements by district. The intent of the combined plan is to develop a consistent approach, Wairarapa eliminating the need for separate district plans. Greater Wellington sought the inclusion of the reference to best practice standards for cycle design and layout and standard transport 24. And while we recognise the reporting officer's concerns that requiring the consideration of best practice design as part of the standard could be subjective, we maintain that the guidance contains important criteria not covered in the standard. These include suitability for multiple types of cycles, minimum dimensions for size and spacing, and design requirements to prevent damage to bikes. We submit that the council, should the council decide not to reference this guidance, that the criteria absent from the standard could be uplifted from the guidance and included in the plan. That's my speaking notes for the transport part of the evidence. Would you like to do
Actually, I think maybe
questions?
we might pause here and
Yep.
and have any questions, and then we can just
Yep.
contain it to that chapter.
Absolutely.
I know there are going to be quite a few questions. Reference, Alistair.
I think have a discussion.
Alistair.
Sure. Okay. Can I just I want to get an understanding of where you're coming from. Where do you live?
Live in Wellington.
Okay, so what do you know about the Wairarapa?
Well, I'm not sure. I work here.
You work in the Wairarapa, do you?
Quite often I'll work out of the Wairarapa office at Greater Wellington. Can I ask why you're asking?
Okay, because I want to know whether you understand how the population distribution is in the Wairarapa.
In terms of what factors are you?
Where do people live?
I think I have a relatively good idea.
Tell me.
In terms of people are distributed through a lot of smaller towns. There's some major centres. Is that?
Okay, so my point is that almost a third of the population do not live in an urban environment.
Mm-hmm. I understand that.
Okay. Do you know how big the area is?
Not off the top of my head, no.
Okay, well, I think it's about 2/3 of the Greater Wellington region. So when you say car parking shouldn't be required, how do you propose that those third of the population that don't live in the urban environment go about their daily business, given that the towns exist to support the rural communities, not the other way around?
Yeah, so the first thing I would note is that car parking is still able to be provided on site. This is not suggesting in any way that, first of all, private vehicle use isn't the dominant mode of transport in the region and through these districts. And so we're not suggesting that anything around that. It's parking requirements. Parking will still be able to be provided on site. That is not impinging on any developer's choice to do that. And in many cases, they will decide to do that. It's just about providing options for developers and consumers to that might not want a car park associated.
Okay, so
their housing.
Can I dovetail into that? Because I think you just mentioned other forms of transport. Are you aware how benefit we are in the Wairarapa of public transport, and specifically, there's one bus that goes from South Wairarapa up to Masterton like once a day. So
yeah, I understand this.
For the provision of those services.
Yeah, I understand this. But it's also within movement within urban environments or within towns. So people going to the shops or whatever, there are other alternatives, biking, walking. It isn't just about movement between those areas. And I understand that the the public transport options can be limited,
Can be,
are limited in many cases.
every case. Well, because let's be realistic here. We have no sustainable public transport. So when you come,
Alistair, can we just keep it?
No, I understand your point.
you come and say we need to do this, that, the next thing. The reason we don't do these things is because we don't have a population basis. We are spread out. Our population is rural. And to hear all these submissions that come from Greater Wellington Regional Council, and you're not the first, by the way, to come and say, this is a great idea. Great, fantastic. But it doesn't work and it's not sustainable. And so when you say car parking, oh, we want this, the rules on urban development were done because they were big conglomerates of parcel. That's not South Wairarapa and Carterton. And to say, oh, if we remove that, people will choose to put car parks in. The rural community can't afford choice of developers. It needs certainty because that's their livelihood. They have to come to these towns to get the goods and services to run their farms and businesses. And when you come up with examples saying, let's just get rid of these minimum standards, that is a really naive place to be, really naive.
Questions, not comments.
Okay, so, next question. So how do you see rural people surviving if car parks aren't there?
Well, I consider will still be car parks there, and all of the current development is set up in a way that currently provides car park. It's just about providing choice. It's not mandating that you can't have a car park on your site. I think developers will recognise, like you say, that a lot of people rely on that, and they will accordingly match their provision of car parks. But again, it's just about providing choice to people. That's all we're saying.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that, Mr. O'Brien? A couple of things. I understand what you're saying about the market might make the necessary adjustments to deal with these matters. Has two questions. Firstly, are you aware of any research or evidence which shows a correlation between the removal of minimum car parking standards and the uptake of other forms of transport, such as public transport or other multimodal forms of transport?
I don't have any evidence of that in a New Zealand context because obviously the changes have only been recently made.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have you got, in a New Zealand context, and I'm conscious that other parts of the Greater Wellington District are Tier 1 authorities, Porirua, Upper Hutt City, Wellington. Are you aware of any evidence where notwithstanding the removal of minimum parking standards, developers have continued to make provision for on-site car parking?
I don't have anything to provide on that.
Okay, thank you.
Ask my next question. Yes. Okay. You used the term behaviour change and mode shift a number of times in your presentation. How do you propose that that occurs when, or what are you meaning by mode shift?
In terms of the greater uptake of alternative modes of transport, whether that's public transport and active transport modes, so walking and cycling.
Who's going to provide this public transport?
Well, the provision of public transport's Greater Wellington. Yeah.
So are you suggesting then if we adopt your proposals here, that there is then an onus on Greater Wellington to come to the party and meet the requirements that you're proposing we meet?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Is there an undertaking from Greater Wellington?
Well, there has been, sorry.
Would there be an undertaking from Greater Wellington?
Well, I can't speak to the specific provisions. Yeah.
Well, Greater Wellington is asking us to make the changes to meet the changes that you are asking for, that Greater Wellington is asking for. There should be a correlation to us adopting those changes in anticipation of investment from Greater Wellington Regional Council. And otherwise, why are we doing it?
Yeah, again, I can't speak to the specifics of what is planned in terms of public transport use, but I can look into that if you want in terms of any potential planned further investment.
Well, it seems that the two of,
Yes, no, I agree with you. Yes.
that's why probably at the stage.
Mr. Brian, just on the transport topic, I had one final question. It relates to the high traffic generating activity, the policy and the rule. Yeah, P7.
Mhm.
And I can't remember the rule number. Give it to you in a minute. Yeah, standard 29, but I think there's a rule 5.
Yeah.
Yes. So both of those, both the policy and P7 and the rule 5, Greater Wellington have asked that the words or subdivision or and subdivision be added. The panel had a large discussion about this morning with the officers.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I wasn't able.
No. I'm just trying to give you the context.
Absolutely.
And we're just wondering why there needs to be a focus on why the rule can't relate solely to land use, and why is the need to have subdivision introduced, and given that well, can you just explain what the rationale for that is from Greater Wellington's perspective?
Yeah, and I realised I prepared some notes on that specifically, actually. So in terms of at the subdivision stage, sort of layout of the development, this can include things like the road corridor width, space available for footpaths and cycle lanes, as well as connections from the subdivision to the wider environment, wider context. And so it's considerations like that that are undertaken at the subdivision stage rather than at a potential development stage.
I mean, most high or all high traffic generating activities will be captured by a land use rule if they exceed the thresholds in the land use rule.
Yeah.
Why can't the panel? Well, why couldn't the panel just rely on the land use rules to?
Just for residential development that wouldn't meet those thresholds.
Just for residential.
Yes.
And 5 refers to all zones.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and the policy doesn't seem to distinguish between residential and non-residential. Is that an unintended?
Yeah, well, I would consider that, yeah, like you say, most other land use activities I would agree that they would meet those thresholds. The specific issue we had was with those residential components. So I guess if it was limited to that, I don't think I'd see any issue with that.
Thank you. That was all that I had on the transport chapter.
Other panel. Okay, we move on to.
Oh, sorry. Just just in relation to the last matter, what would if the panel was to give relief to that request, what higher order document would we be relying on in terms of? Is there anything in the regional policy statements that we could draw on to justify the subdivision control, albeit just on residential?
Yeah, so I think I can't remember the policy. I can provide that off the top of my head, but it's about land use, transport and land use integration would probably be the relevant one. I can identify that for you.
If you could pass that through to the officer, that would be useful.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Sorry.
Over. Hey, subdivision.
This is a bit shorter, but Greater Wellington supports the subdivision chapter and again acknowledges the work of officers in implementing RPS1 change direction. So Greater Wellington sought definitions of water sensitive urban design and hydraulic neutrality. My understanding after liaising with the officer at Greater Wellington involved in that conferencing is that the water sensitive urban design and hydraulic neutrality direction will be included in the plan integrated in zone chapters rather than in separate three waters chapter. It's also my understanding that these concepts are not specifically named in the plan and therefore there may not be a need for a definition. However, I consider it may assist in plan interpretation, might not have a material impact. And obviously our position is still dependent on the outcome of that conferencing.
We're very aware of that.
Yeah. With respect to subdivision objective 3, we support the changes made in the summary statement to place equivalent with an active transport networks and services. However, I consider these public transport references in brackets should be added after the infrastructure reference rather than the roads, as they are included under that definition, which was originally pointed out in the 42A report. And then finally, Greater Wellington strongly supports the inclusion of the new subdivision policy to give effect direction in RPS change 1 and managing the effects of development, including subdivision on freshwater. Yeah, that's all I had to say about subdivision.
Clarify on sub 03.
Yeah.
The words in bracket, you would prefer them to come after infrastructure. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the point originally made by the officer was that infrastructure already covers matters that we were seeking to be in that. So I think that would make sense to have that those as they're included already in the definition of infrastructure, not the definition of roads. I was just pointing out my evidence that roads also falls in that same infrastructure definition. So there'd be no reason to not have it in there, if that makes sense.
I've just got a question about paragraph 50 of your statement. And it's just my ignorance. I wasn't sure where the conferencing was at on the three waters concept. Are you saying it's completed?
I don't think it's been completed, but I wasn't involved in that conferencing, but my understanding is that there's been some things established. Has
your colleague been involved?
No.
Okay, just that you said Greater Wellington has participated in this conferencing.
Yeah, there has been a session on that conferencing, as my understanding, where the general direction of travel going forward was established, but maybe not the detail on some things. But yeah, goodness, not sure on that.
Wesley, can you give us an update on that?
Looking it up to remind myself.
This came out of this hearing stream 1.
Yes.
Yeah. This was yeah. And your colleague was involved in that.
Mrs. Olner was there. Yeah, well, she's it wasn't her that was involved in this most recent conferencing. She's
okay.
And about
Mr. Shield.
Yeah.
Okay. There were two sets of conferencing. There was
the conferencing on the strategic direction and the three waters chapter. Yeah.
But the latest conferencing,
P4 and P6 on that.
No, on freshwater. The joint witness statement records that there wasn't to be a three waters chapter. Three waters chapter introduced, and that the existing provisions like stormwater and water and wastewater effectively managed.
Yeah.
Achieve the objective.
Okay.
Agreed to be added.
That online, that AWS.
It's in response to 14.
Okay. I completely missed that. So that's right. Okay.
There was a bundle of responses about 2 weeks ago.
Yes. Yes, okay. Okay, I'll need to relook at that.
Any other?
Yes, one other. The request for the new sub P9 on freshwater. It's on your last page of your evidence, Mr. O'Brien. Yeah. What's this? Generally, this has a RPS plan change 1 basis.
Yeah.
And there have been some appeals though to plan change number 1 decisions, haven't there?
Yes, so I think I'll just find the paragraph.
You've said there's direction within the RPS change 1 that outlines the need to consider freshwater issues in the context of urban development and subdivision. Consider that the following objective and policies are relevant. This is the top page 16. Objective 12, policy W3, policy 56. Yeah. So are those provisions subject to appeal?
So they're not subject to appeal, and not a legal expert, but understanding is that freshwater the freshwater planning process, so there were no appeal points on those received. So
okay,
they're beyond challenge, but not yet fully operative.
Understood.
So yeah, effectively, but
it's appropriate to put considerable weight on those. Okay. If the panel was of a mind to run with P9 as requested and as recommended, how do you see that given effect to at the rules standard stage?
I would agree with the officer who I think made comments related to that, pointing out how that would be. I would agree with that.
The officer had suggested that the way to deal with that is through the matter of discretion dealing with sections 108 and 220, which deals with conditions.
Yeah.
And I asked her this morning, that assumes that conditions can achieve what the policy seeks to do, which is avoid, remedy, or mitigate the effects. Sometimes avoidance involves something other than a condition. It involves a decline. And if we're dealing with a controlled activity, of decline isn't a possibility.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree with your point there. I would potentially need to do some thinking on how that could be given effect to through those rules.
This relief is sort of like a bottom up request.
Yeah.
It's superimposing a policy on top of some rules that are there already.
Absolutely.
And I'm just worried about the alignment between them.
Yeah. No, I agree. Agree that needs to be addressed.
Well, maybe we might want to have a discussion with the officer on that. That was all.
Yeah. Anything further? Craig? Thank you for your time today, and we will leave. Explore perhaps that new policy.
So we may not issue a minute on direction there. I think the verbal direction is probably sufficient.
Yeah, that's fine. Cool.
We will certainly need that to happen and
yeah,
bit of speed.
I understand that.
The officer will need to submit the ROR within 3 weeks of this hearing.
Yeah, I'll make that a priority.
Thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thank you, panel.
Right, that brings us to the end of our signatures, and I propose that Marty Davies for lunch and Commissioner Plymouth has just added to his tab with his phone going off.
Do not disturb it.
Yeah, it's growing. I think every hearing. So is half an hour sufficient for lunch for everybody?
Yeah.
So we reconvene at 2 p.m.
Okay.
Thank you.